I will introduce the network today, and my colleague, Dr. Tristan Bradshaw, will moderate the proceedings, which is fantastic. So let me start by just saying a few words about the network and begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which our network is based, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And we recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The Critical Antiquities Network and the Critical Antiquities Workshop, of which this is an example, was founded by Tristan Bradshaw and myself in 2020 to link scholars whose research takes place at the intersection of ancient traditions and contemporary critical theories. For Tristan and I, the idea of a critical antiquity is that the contemporary critique of modernity and the capitalist present finds its most powerful impetus in its dialogue with the thought and practice of the ancient world. We believe that it is not simply that antiquity offers an alternate pole from which to grasp the present in its historical situatedness, but rather we advance the more radical suggestion that our modalities of critique are founded upon, and perhaps ought to be founded upon, the expansive dialogues we enter into, consciously or unconsciously, with the form and content of antiquities performances, literature, and institutional practices. But our turn to antiquity should not be conceived of as romantic. In our view, antiquity simultaneously serves as a standpoint and object of critique to enliven us to the possibilities and the limitations of contemporary life. So with that introduction, I'll now turn to my colleague Tristan, who will chair proceedings here on in.
Thanks a lot, Ben. So just a word about the format for today. So we're going to give Andrés, author of our book, a chance to give a bit of a discussion or a bit of a synopsis of it for 10 to 15 minutes. Then we're going to hear from Ely Orrego-Torres, who will present some comments for 15 minutes or so. Sadly, our planned speaker, Dimitri Kasimis, had an emergency come up and is unable to join us this morning. So we're sad about that because she is fantastic and would have been fantastic. But for what it's worth, Ben and I are going to try and supplement the expert comments that Ely will provide, and we'll do so for 10 to 15 minutes, I hope. We'll give Andrés a chance to respond, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and I'll direct you about how to ask your questions once we get to that point. So before I hand it over to Andrés, let me introduce our distinguished guest. So Andrés Henao Castro is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Prior to his appointment there, he received his PhD in Political Science from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and was the Carl Lowenstein Fellow at Amherst College. Between 2018 and 2020, Andrés was the postdoctoral fellow of the Academy of Global Humanities and Critical Theory at the University of Bologna and Duke University. And Andrés's work is situated between many different areas, as you will all know if you read any of his book, but these include political theory, ancient and modern, critical theory, decolonial theory, psychoanalysis, and deconstruction. But his work is grounded in rethinking the relationship between politics and aesthetics in relation to gender-differentiated colonial logics of capitalist accumulation. I've taken that straight from his profile page on his website, and I didn't come up with that myself. Antigone in the Americas is his first book, but he's published many articles in an array of journals that reflect his wide learning and interdisciplinary research identity. Andrés is also work on two new book projects, one entitled White Masochism and another called The Militant Intellect, Critical Theory's Conceptual Personae, which is under contract with Rowman and Littlefield. So please join me in welcoming Andrés, and thank you for sharing your book with us.
Thanks, Tristan. Thank you all so much for being here. I am situated in, as I mentioned, for those of you who are just coming, in the south side of Chicago, which is also the land unceded territory and the homeland of various indigenous peoples, including those at the Council of the Three Fires. So I would also like to join Ben on acknowledging settler colonialism is indeed the conditions, the material conditions of the work that we are doing. And this book is actually about settler colonialism. So the acknowledgement is not just the conventional performative, important as it is of doing that, but also it actually is quite important in terms of my research and what interests me in my work. And I would also, so thanks to Tristan, thanks to Ben, thanks to Eli for agreeing to do this and doing the book launch. Having participated in several of these meetings is like, this is kind of the perfect space for this book to be. It's like, I do feel that we share that critical understanding of antiquities and a way of thinking that the engagement with the classical tradition needs to be in conversation with also critical race theory, queer of color critique, like all the other disciplines that maybe hasn't quite entered the canon in the same capacity as tragedy is perhaps part of it. And as I know that this is being recorded, this is also a moment to send my energy and my good vibes to Demi, that Demi couldn't be here, and she's a very good friend. And if you have a chance to read more of the book on your own, I think Tristan is going to put the code. There's a good substantial discount that SUNY Press is giving because it's prohibitively expensive at the moment. I'm really hoping the paperback would come soon, but nonetheless, give it a look. Tristan will share the code, and you will see that Demi's work has been quite influential for my own. As I move from just the citizen to think about the relationship of the citizen to the metic and to the enslaved, and think about that in terms of race. And I am in dialogue with Demi, and this was an opportunity also to express my gratitude for the significance of her research. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see a little bit of a PowerPoint that I prepared for you. Is it working?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. This is the image that is in the cover of the book, and it's part of an art collection done by a political artist in Colombia, Juan Manuel Echeverria. You can check all the work is online, and if you type Reiki NN, is a good friend, is a very important political intervention. And thus a reconstruction of the transformation of the tombstones in Puerto Berrío, and in a case in which, because of the phenomenon of enforced disappearances in Colombia, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, the population in Puerto Berrío has been recovering bodies from the Magdalena River. And those bodies, the state buries in a mass mausoleum under a number. So it's NN, and then there is a registration number because they have been unidentified. And then the population, quite often, having family members of their own who have also been enforced disappear, is starting adopting them. Which is the title also of the novel that I discussed in chapter 3, that is called Los Escogidos. Adoption is not quite the best translation of that, but chosen is also like literally, it's too literal and it doesn't quite capture. So this is a kind of moment of adopting the death and then caring for the death in a gesture of trying to rehumanize the one that has been dispossessed of any kind of identity. And what interested me a lot about this one is that there was an effort, at least of the person who was doing it, not to gender it. And so it's written Danielle, and then you have the parenthesis A in order to accommodate the potential undesirability of the gender. And there's a ways in which I think it captures really well the plurality of things that I'm trying to bring together in this book as a kind of an Antigonian gesture. This is the table of contents. So those of you who saw the intro, you don't get this page, but this is also my way of showing you, what is inside. Is 4 chapters, this intro and this conclusion. And here I would like to take some of my time to tease this out. Okay, so this chapter, I'm trying to move in history quite broadly. And so we move from ancient Athens in antiquity to a discussion of the US antebellum South in modernity, the long 16th century, and antiquity. I'm only exclusively referring to Sophocles' time, the time of Antigone. And then to what I'm calling postmodernity, which is the establishment in the post-Chilean dictatorship in Latin America, and certain transformations in the modality of state power, particularly with the phenomenon of enforced diseases. In this case, I draw from Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, even though I'm not there, let's say, to the nation state as a territory. And finally, it's a kind of different temporality, which is not just the kind of human scale temporality, but an engagement with the literature and a critique of the literature on the Anthropocene, drawing from critical race theory, from Françoise Berge, and from Catherine Yusuf, in mobilizing the category of the racial capitalocene to properly resituate the move from the human to the post-human, or the complication of those who have been dehumanized, and try to reach for those voices. So it's both broad historically, it travels in space, and it also travels in theory. And so each chapter, which is both traveling spatially and temporally, is also an engagement with a different kind of theoretical field, all of which, in my view, have given us the most, let's say, robust political interpretations of Antigone. So I open with democratic theory, and there's an engagement there with Helen Foley and Bonnie Honig, Jackson Sier, and many others, on how they turned to antiquity to reconceptualize democracy as agonistic, or as more radical, as redistribution of the sensible, and so forth and so on. In modernity, there is an engagement with the reception of psychoanalysis in feminist and queer theory. When I move to postmodernity, there's an engagement with the literature on biopolitics. And finally, when I'm engaging with the question of the Anthropocene, there is an engagement with critical theory, a lot of work on the spectrum, primarily with deconstruction, with the work of Jacques Derrida. And what is the upshot, or some of the offshoots of these engagements? So in antiquity, which serves kind of as the guiding framework for the rest of the book. And I confess I'm not a classicist, and I'm sure some of you who are experts in classics might have realized that in the text. Like there are perhaps things that I don't treat with the rigor that maybe someone with a training in classics could have. And there's just one chapter in classics, and really my interest is on the Americas and what happens with both the conquest of the Americas and the institutionalization of the transatlantic slave trade, in order to reconsider the multiple genealogies through which we receive Antigone. Having said that, nonetheless, the effort of reworking that was to move to those binaries, of the citizen and the slave, or the woman, man, and so forth and so on, that have been the work of so much critical theory, and to try to think about triangulations and triads, which is also a move in settler colonial critique, in trying to think about the relationship between settler, native, and alien. And I can also talk a little bit about where that work is, and where it's going, and what's my intervention there. But this was a way of moving from the agency of the citizen to the agency of the metic and the agency of the enslaved, and to try to see the play or read the play, and perhaps take a different democratic message from that misinterpreted agency. In the case of modernity, my engagement or my critique of the reception of psychoanalysis in feminist and queer theory was through primarily Black feminism, Afro-pessimism for sure, and Black and trans, Black queer and trans theory, the case of C. Riley Norton, Calvin Warren, and others. And the claim here is to mobilize the category of social death in ways that go beyond, let's say, the reception it had in Judith Butler's work, and to try to problematize not just the pre-political exclusion of kinship, which is Butler's work, but actually the sociality that is assumed for kinship to make sense at all, which is part of the feminist criticism or the feminist mobilization and radicalization of the concept of natal alienation as constitutive of social death. So for me, the death drive, like to put in conversation the notion of the social death with the literature on psychoanalysis on the death drive and the ways in which Antigone is kind of a paradigmatic, subject of the enactment of the death drive in both object work, which is phenomenal, and I'm trying to do justice to these things, like not to take away from their interventions, but to show that in once your positionality and the kind of concerns that you have shifts towards an account of in things that are interested to us in critical race theory, critical race philosophy, and so forth, the translation is not that easy. And when one starts thinking about, let's say, forced choice, and you read inside the Harman criticizes how to speak about a choice being forced when every choice, in a sense, could be regarded as force, that this then creates a friction there with the psychoanalytic corpus. In postmodernity, I engage the literature on biopolitics, and in a sense, I try to foreground the development of necropolitics from Achille Mbembe and the reception of Mbembe's work in Sayek Valencia, in Elba Orozco Mendoza, in other folks that are trying to understand different economies of care against neoliberal disposability, in ways that I think go beyond the Foucauldian, or that try to bring back something that I feel never quite enters the Foucauldian framework, which is that Foucault indeed traces biopolitics and claims that indeed the notion of race goes all the way back to the colonies, but the colonies kind of remain an afterthought and are never problematized. And obviously, I'm not the first one to say that. Stoller's work on race and the education of desire is a case in point. Weheliges, Avies Viscus. So there's a lot that has already been criticized on that remark. I'm trying to figure out, what from then the move to necropolitics and to rethink the relationship of settler life to the death of indigeneity and the death of Blackness place to understand also how is it that democracies repackage themselves under conditions that are still quite settler colonial, but that the policy is still trying to sell itself in a sense as democratic, and that's where I feel the case of enforced disappearances actually is quite interesting to think about the indistinction of these different technologies of power that Foucault distinguishes in the global south, of the sovereignty, discipline, power, and biopolitical technologies. So it's a way of emphasizing the necro rather than the bios in this case, and complicating also and trying to show how maternal activism, which is otherwise dismissed in other kind of actions, how feminists that are sensitive to the kind of different economic arrangements in which kinship is in a sense excluded as a not just as a kinship category, sorry, maternity is exploited as a political category, not just as kinship, but actually as an insurgent kind of new sociality, new mode of care, particularly with what the women activists are doing, feminists in Ciudad Juarez, in Colombia, in Chile as well. And then the end is the end is like, okay, we have gone through the human. In a sense, we have problematized what the human displaces outside of its orbit, and through those that is put into social death. So let's confront what does this have to say about ecology, move to the posthuman, and then the gesture of the Anthropocene. And I take kind of a detour that is not the most intuitive one, which is Derrida's reading of Hegel. And a moment in which Hegel is also thinking about how the burial right plays an important role in making a distinction between what is natural, what is conceived as natural, hence, geological age, and then what is conceived as human, hence cultural consciousness, will. And I kind of raise a critique that in the very good reading that Derrida offers of Antigone, he nonetheless fails to offer the same kind of reading to Hegel's really problematic statements with regards to Africa. And I then link that also to some kind of a spirits of Marx in which perhaps he would not like to inscribe deconstruction, even though in Spectres of Marx, he's also thinking about deconstruction as part of that genealogy of critique. And in the back of my mind is Chris Hani, which is the important, socialist revolutionary of the anti-apartheid movement. The book is dedicated to Chris Hani. But then that tradition of, a different kind of reception of anti-colonial, anti-capitalist Marxism plays absolutely no role in the rest of the book. So I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking, why is it that this spectrality and this cannot enter critical theory, and why do we have the difficulty of doing that? And that perhaps if we confront that, then we can also address actually the ecological questions and give them a much more material foundation in what many of us prefer to refer to as the racial capitalism. And the ending of that move is that we would need to move from critical theory's normal framework to think about laws, which are mourning and melancholia, from Walter Benjamin to there's so many writing on that, to try to mobilize wake work, which is a category introduced by Christina Sharp, and black mourning from Fred Moten, and then to try to show what is it that this modality of confronting loss, how is this different from both mourning and melancholia? And I engage with different plays. For sure, the main text of Antigone runs through the whole book, and I'm constantly returning back to it. I would highlight three main contributions, and I would end with that. I know that I'm taking a little bit too long. One is this, that for me, what I was trying to put in the foreground of the analysis is this racialized logic of valuation that is interrogating this triad, in which, in a sense, Antigone feels that in order to rescue Polynesians from the violence that Polynesians is subjected, she needs to reinscribe the abjection of the enslaved. And then I'm thinking about what does that mean for the politics, a kind of decolonial politics associated with mourning. The second one is this methodological thing, which I think this is perhaps something that speaks to both the Critical Antiquities Network as a modality of reading, but that has also a legacy with the post-humanism, like that really important school of thought and intervention that started there, and many others, and it gives continuity, but it also takes a little bit of a different approach to digesting and regurgitating text, and then digesting them again through a different kind of theory. So maybe for a funny thing is that when the book was out for reviewers, it faced that kind of difficulty that it would be sent, and this is a book on Antigone, to Foxing Classics that had absolutely no engagement with Afro-pessimism, of queer color critique, or any of the theories that are actually driving this conversation. and then it was all about just that chapter 1, and I was like, well, the book is not. So it's part of the challenge of the colonial rumination, and is that you bring other sets of mediating texts in order to bear on how to reinterpret Antigone. And finally, this notion of militant mourning, how to think about loss and a confrontation as a way of actually moving the discussion towards an undoing of colonialism and an undoing of capitalism. I leave it there, and thanks a lot for listening. And I'm really excited to hear Eli's comments. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrés. That was very interesting. Let me introduce our commentator. So Ely Orrego-Torres is a graduate student in the Department of Political Science at Northwestern University, where she's also a Mellon Cluster Fellow in Critical Theory. Prior to that, she received her Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the Pontifical Catholic University in Chile, and her Master of Arts in Contemporary Thought from Diego Portales University in Chile. Ely's research brings together political theory and international relations to address questions on religion and politics in the global context. Drawing on critical theories and liberation theologies, Ely examines narratives of religious freedom, political theologies, and secularisms in the history of the present. Her work is particularly focused on global and transnational relations between North-South and South-South, with this particular interest in the Americas and India. And so she's very well placed to comment on Andrés' book and contribute to this conversation. Ely has published numerous articles in both Spanish and in English, and she has recently edited in 2019 a volume in Spanish entitled Las Paradojas de la Libertad Religiosa en America Latina. We're very thankful to have her comment on this book today, so please join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you, Tristan and Ben, for the invitation to discuss the book. I'm honored to be here, and kind of also like honored to be the only one, because I have like a lot of responsibility in doing like a good presentation of your book, a good discussion. And also especially thank you, Andrés, for your book. To be honest, I only have praises for your book. Is amazing. I really enjoyed reading your book. Okay, so in his brilliant book, Antigone in the Americas, Andrés Henao Castro invites us to look at the novel and compelling interpretation of the Greek tragedy of Antigone. Through his lens, Henao Castro develops a variety of Antigones, geographically, culturally, and historically situated in the Americas. Unlike contemporary readings of the famous play, he focuses on the triangular model of political membership from ancient Greece, namely slaves, medics, and citizens. His interest in exploring this triad is to explain how it informs the modern colonial world, which is drastically affected by the rationalized logic that settled colonial capitalism produced through the European conquest of the Americas and institutionalization of modern slavery via the transatlantic slave trade. Although Antigone is a widely debated and interpreted tragedy in contemporary political theory and philosophy in the West, Henao Castro aims to include marginalized voices in the literary and theoretical interpretation of classical text. His book, in that sense, is a conversation to bring into debate Western and non-Western authors, including canonical and innovative approaches to the interpretation of Antigone. On the one hand, the oft-quoted philosophers and political theories debating the interpretation of the Greek tragedies, such as Bonnet Honig, Jacques Rancière, or Jacques Derrida, among others. On the other hand, he aptly relies on commonly marginalized and isolated voices in mainstream debates, such as several colonial critics, Black and women of color feminists, and queer and trans of color critics, such as Carrie Cohen, Lee Edelman, Achille Bembe, among others. Drawing from political theories, but also the current and past itineracies of the Americas, particularly Latin America, Andrés provides a nuanced account of the decolonial disaffiliation of the Antigones presented in his book. In that regard, the book transitions from questions about embodiment, human dignity, violence, terror, and coloniality. In his introduction and throughout the book, Henao Castro answers two main questions. First, what would happen if one restituted the decent mourning of Antigone under settled colonial conditions that make the interdiction of native and alien burial into the condition of possibility for the humanization of the settled death? And second, how does such recontextualization of Antigone affects the political interpretation of the play in critical theory? And he relies here in democratic theory, feminist and queer theory, the theory of biopolitics, and the theory of deconstruction. His response to these questions is divided into 4 chapters of the book, each of them unraveling different moments of coloniality throughout the Americas. Arguably, Henao Castro emphasized and problematized the complex and ambivalent political membership of the Medic. His book's most interesting argumentation occurs when focusing on the Medic and the slave. The positionality of the Medic is one of partial inclusion and partial exclusion, while the slave is fully excluded. According to Henao Castro, most of the existing readings of Antigone offer an exclusive perspective of the citizen, rather than focusing on the subordinated and misinterpreted Medic and the slave as position from which to rethink the politics of display. For the author, the Medic then represents that in-between position, first extended to natives and aliens. To this, I will add that the Medic can now be understood as those persons that cannot participate in the agora, which is the assembly, because of their political condition rather than their human condition. For instance, undocumented migrants, refugees, and stateless people. In other words, Henao Castro's book also delves into the critique already posed by Hannah Arendt about human rights, and it affirms their contemporaneity and need for constant deconstruction. People do not have human rights because they belong to humanity. On the contrary, people have human rights because they belong to a nation state. That is the paradox of human rights that Arendt wanted to denounce, and why she's skeptical of the notion of human rights associated with the sovereign state. Liberal society expects that our political community recognize human rights, albeit our governments are detaining people on the frontiers, returning immigrants to the violence of their hometowns, and the everyday violation of their human rights. To accomplish the respect for human rights, a state cannot be the only guarantees of those rights. It is a responsibility of the whole community, but especially of humanity. Having human rights is to be recognized as a human being beyond the categories of membership and sovereignty. This is particularly demonstrated by Henao Castro in his reading of burial in Antigone's tragedy. Antigone in the America contributes to critical theory and broadly speaking, like political theory in a variety of ways. I will say that there are like 3 main contributions of his book, in addition to the ones that he mentions in the introduction. So firstly, Andrés Henao Castro writes in his introduction that this book is trying to understand, complicate, and problematize why Antigone is in the Americas, and suggests how it can be otherwise. So he makes a compelling case about the problematization and understanding of the role that racial and sexual capitalism plays in who counts and who does not count for the settled polis. Using the concept of decolonial rumination and decolonial cacophony, Henao Castro delved into the still open veins of the Americas, as Eduardo Galeano wrote decades ago. Regarding rumination and cacophony, he unravels an interpretation of Antigone that dialogues with the West, while at the same time acknowledge and puts in the first place the history of the Americas in relation to this Greek tragedy. He turns to their characters and resignifies their position in the play across the interpretation of the Americas with their struggles and identities. So for example, he uses like different plays, for example, the Yupik Antigone from 1984, with both Antigone and Creon are part of the Yupik people. Antigona Gonzalez from 2012, from Tamaulipas, who is searching for her missing brother, or the more recent one, Antigone Ferguson from 2019, where Antigone is black but Creon is white. In doing so, he approaches the second concept of decolonial cacophony as the amalgamation of different voices echoing the history of the Americas through his critical lens. Secondly, Henao Castro deconstructs the Americas as a global territory. So I think that this is an important contribution of the book too, because generally, like the depiction of Latin America demonstrates the importance of regional issues resounding with the global significance of settler colonialism. In that regard, it opens new interpretations and dialogues between the so-called global North and global South. And now Castro does what few scholars have attempted to do in political theory, which is to put in conversation critical theory from the North with the authors from the South and their own experiences and stories of colonialism. Thirdly, and I think that this is one of the more interesting concepts that he problematized, is that he advanced a novel account of the dictatorships' deadly consequences in Latin America, given the neoliberalism that first started in Chile and is still prevailing in the chapter 3 on colonial postmodernity. So maybe he can delve deeper into this concept, but he advanced an interesting concept that is necrodialectics, which refers to those bodies of enforced disappearance, mostly by paramilitary forces, for instance, in Colombia and Mexico. So this is interesting because at the same time put like the contrast between the history of the dictatorships and the disappearance of people with the current situation that is going on with these new forces that are emerging in Colombia and Mexico. So to continue maybe with the debate, I have like a couple of questions, so maybe like more, rather than questions, like more like if maybe you can talk more about like how it's like next and how we can continue debating about these issues. So for example, in line with the idea of globally interconnected violences, I wonder if you can develop further like the idea of Anthropocene that you mentioned and that you explained in the introduction, especially like from a more contextualization in Latin America, especially when we're talking about like non-human subjects, like this idea of nature, for example, and how neoliberalism has affected extremely like the ecologies in Latin America and the extraction and the destruction of environments, while at the same time, and this is maybe interesting to mention, Latin America is recognized like one of the regions with more disappearance of ecological activists. So that is something that maybe we can acknowledge in that debate. And I wonder also like how your research might open new questions about the idea of human dignity and political membership in pandemic times. This is something that you mentioned at the end. So I think that you were like finishing your book while we were living in the pandemic. So that was like really interesting. Because you mentioned some ideas about the current pandemic situation and the racialization of the necropolitical. But how do you see the current situation affecting or not the political membership of sexual and racialized subjects? Or for instance, and I think that this is in connection with this idea of the chapter 3 about the necrodialectics, how do you understand or see the lack of burial by the loved ones and the trauma that is generated in many families, that they are losing their loved ones because of the pandemic, or they lost them without a proper burial, and how to rehumanize them? I mean, the whole idea of like the proper burial, that it was impossible because of the pandemic situation. So those are my questions. So thank you so much again, Andres, for your book, and Tristan and Ben.
Thanks a lot, Ely, for a stimulating engagement. So in case people arrived late, sadly, we haven't got Dimitri Kasimis with us. We are sad to not have her, but we're very happy to have Dr. Ben Brown to join us. Now, Ben, I just realized that for the sake of consistency, should probably be introducing you, but I haven't prepared anything. And I feel like it would be a little perfunctory. Anyway,
well,
you want to just
that would be matched by my lack of preparation as well, given the short notice of this. So I crave everyone's forgiveness for rendering my response as more of a series of questions rather than as a definitive response or engagement with the work as a whole. Other than to say, though, Andres, the book was enormously stimulating of my thinking around Sophocles' Antigone. I'm a classicist and a Greek historian, so I come to this play, so to speak, from the other end. I approach it from the archaic period, and so the Sophocles' Antigone comes fairly late, whereas for you it comes right at the beginning. And that means that I often think about Sophocles and his plays more generally, but particularly the three Theban plays, the Oedipus Tyrannus, the OC, and the Antigone, from the point of view of the spectre of domination and the spectre of the tyrant, the figure of the Tyrannos. In Greek thought, and where sometimes I think that where the Oedipus Tyrannus is so called, one could also rename the Antigone Tyrannus, in the sense that Antigone too has this ambiguous position from which she speaks, which threatens not just simply the intervention of the outsider or the excluded, but the intervention of a similarly outsider and excluded figure who is the Tyrannos, in other words, the one who wields precisely the kind of dictatorial and paramilitary power that to some extent we're resisting as well, right? So what do I mean by all of that? Well, when we do a close reading of the Antigone, one of the polarities that consistently emerges throughout Sophocles' language is the opposition between the reflexive pronoun autos, which means the self, and compound verbs which begin with sun, which means together or with. And this antithesis or opposition that inhabits this play firmly places Antigone in this position of being of really valorizing the individual versus society, right? Antigone is a defender to some extent, and a very ardent defender of the isolated and independent self as the position from which decisions and action should kind of arise. In fact, very interestingly, the only use of the adjective autonomos, which means independent or living under one's own rules or something like that, which is almost exclusively applied in Greek to city-states and cities and collectivities, is only applied to an individual in this play, in line 821. She is called autonomos. That is to say, she's a paradoxical figure, on the one hand, who lives underneath rules and regulations, normally, but rules and regulations that are of her own devising. In other words, she lives in a kind of almost solitary state in which she has devised a set of rules and regulations under which she lives, and she denies the claim of any other system of normoy to be able to dictate to her or judge her behaviour. And in that sense, as she goes on to say, when the chorus say, oh, you should be very pleased because you're going down to Hades autonomos, and then she kind of laments and continues to lament. The chorus then say, well, there's an ancestral curse that hangs over you. And she connects that solitary selfhood to her father's curse. And her father's curse is not just simply the incest, it's not just simply the parricide. The father's curse is precisely the curse of being a tyrant, the one who claims to stand outside the circulation of power invested within a community, and who says, because of my special status, I get to stand apart and I get to be treated differently and I get to have privileges. In a way, then, Antigone is a metic, or at least articulates her metic status, not simply as a kind of a way of articulating her exclusion from the community of citizens, but also her exclusion at the other end of the excess, right? That is to say, she is the exclusive sovereign, right? She's asserting the position of sovereignty as the point of her exclusion, not the position of marginalization or the dispossession of power. So Antigone kind of oscillates back and forth between sovereignty and kind of extreme lack of sovereignty, right? She's hyper-sovereign in that she's Oedipus's daughter, but she's also sort of, hyper sovereign in the sense that she's also lacks any kind of power to act. And in that sense, I was struck too by the way in which in Greek history and in Greek thought, and this is not unique to Greece, it also appears in Rome, that sovereigns are typically metics, right? When the Romans, for instance, invited lawgivers to come in and to reorganize religion and law and political order and so forth, they're almost always outsiders. Numa Pompilius was a Sabine. Servius Tullius was supposed to have been a slave. The Tarquinii were Etruscans. Romulus himself was not really Roman. In fact, I've always been struck by the fact that the founder of a community necessarily doesn't belong to that community. And so every founder is necessarily a metic as well, right? So sovereignty and metichood, if you like, are kind of curiously aligned. And so I think, at least when I was reading this, I felt a little bit worried that we were only kind of thinking about Antigone as occupying one pole of the metic's status, which is exclusion, when one other way in which her meticness, if you like, is being articulated here as the Turanos. In fact, Oedipus's own status as a metic in the Oedipus Tyrannus is as the ruler of Thebes, right? I mean, so that in itself is kind of interesting. Anyway, that's just one set of thoughts that I had about that. And I will just end this by saying too that Rome is an interesting counterpoint to everything that you've been saying as well, in that the slave doesn't become a metic in Rome when the slave is manumitted. The slave becomes a citizen. There's a sort of direct line to citizenship. And in fact, there is this wonderful example in Plutarch's Life of Gaius Gracchus, where when Scipio Aemilianus declares that Tiberius Gracchus had been justly killed for what he'd done, the crowd erupt in one voice to condemn him for saying that. And he rebukes them by saying, you were all slaves once upon a time that I conquered and sold into slavery, and now you are citizens. So be quiet, you who are not the children of Italy, but only their stepchildren, right? The slave becoming a citizen is the child who becomes the stepchild, the foster child. And that is, I think, also an interesting metaphor for some of the sort of the ideas that are coming out of your amazing book. And And so, and this is just a sort of a way of sort of complimenting you on just the stimulating way in which you provoke my thoughts about both the Antigone and about medics and slaves. And so, I very much enjoyed it, and I very much enjoy finishing. We'll enjoy finishing the rest of your book too. So thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Just to round this off, at the risk of taking way too much time, I'll provide one set of thoughts and a question, and then we'll hand it over to Andrés. So I'm particularly interested in the methodological dimension of your book and the claim that you're making about decolonial rumination. So thinking about this as a standpoint, which is the language you embrace in the introduction anyway, I'm really interested in whether you would go further than you do in the introduction and speak of the standpoint of decolonial rumination in terms of the new. So that's my question, and let me contextualize it a little bit. It seems to me that there is overall within critical theory and critical antiquities as a whole, as it is the broader field of critical theory that engages classics, a general kind of aversion to the new. So let's go with Jim Porter's terms of classicism and classicization, which you nicely discuss in the introduction. So if classicism merely claims to disclose what's universal, then it's only making claims to what's always there, and it's merely kind of uncovering what's already there. Whereas classicization, well, it more particularizes the classics by returning to the classics in their conditions of their production, their historical production. And so it problematizes the relationship between the past and the present. It may provide analogies, or it may not. It may be a mirror of the present, or it may not. When you speak about decolonial rumination in terms of the broken mirror, you seem to kind of negativize classicization in at least two respects. So first, by saying that the past isn't really past, you want to emphasize, as Honig does in some respects, that there is this huge reception history that mediates our relationship to these texts, and you can't discount those from our own engagements with them. So that's one way in which you kind of negativize it. You say the past isn't really past. And second, I think you want to say that what we want from the past isn't what is patently present to us in these ancient texts, but we really want to access its silences. That's the word that you use. And those silences, well, they're not even the ancient silences, they're our silences. The medic and the slave, that's what you're interested in, as a kind of, black mirror, as you say, or so broken mirror of the present. But by framing decolonial rumination in this way, you do seem to align yourself with the prominent strand of critical theory, which I attribute to the influence of Theodore Adorno, that really denies the possibility of identifying difference because of the imposition of identity within the context of commodified life in capitalism. So I won't elaborate, but for people that aren't familiar, Adorno says that Hegel represents the worst kind of intellectualization of modernity. He imposes this identity, this homogenization on everything that's different through his kind of transhistorical accounting of history, and his claim to understand it. And Adorno attributes this rather to a mistaken homogenization, where the commodity form of capitalism has effectively been transposed from the relationship between two objects, which are heterogeneous and different, and in exchange, in commodity exchange, they're made to be homogeneous. Adorno sees Hegel performing the same kind of thing at the level of ideas. And so Adorno is extremely reticent to claim any difference in his engagement with history, with ideas, with other supposedly alternative forms of life. Now, it's in response to this that Adorno comes up with negative dialectics, and he thinks that it's through this passage that we can kind of move towards something else, something which he never wants to claim to have found. But interestingly, like you, Adorno also finds resources in the ancient past, especially in the Odyssey, to do this. Anyway, so my question is there any room for the new or the creation of the new in your understanding of decolonial rumination as it engages with antiquity? Or for you, is it more about the kind of disclosure of the present and what's already there, and that being the sum of your critical engagement with both the present and the past? I hope that all makes sense.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you all. Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Tristan. Thanks, Ben, for all of those. That's a lot of comments. I'm supposed to talk 10 minutes now to, my God, address Adorno and negative dialectics as it relates to this. We could spend all night. I think I'm gonna say some very unsatisfying things, and then we can open it up for questions from the audience. I think, Ben, that that's also how I teach Oedipus Tyrannus. Now, I normally teach this play from the perspective of the spectator, which is, predominantly the Athenian citizenry as an education into democracy's critique of tyranny. And I don't think, I think that if I say that the question of Antigone's, let's say, mimicry of Creon sovereignty, or even the emphasis on her autonomy and her singularity is something that has been written about again and again on the play. And so in my reading was like, what can you say that is new? Maybe this also speaks to Tristan, about a play that accumulates 2,500 years of commentary. And what I felt, this is, yes, like everybody is trying to confront why does she move from the presumable law of universal inclusiveness, the God demanded the right for all, to the extreme opposite, which is singularity. And there's many ways in which you can cash that out, like Bonnie Honig does it as the confrontation between exceptional aristocratic singularity and democratic exchangeability. Lacan does something different in terms of like, it is until she arrives to singularity that she purges her own desire in the much more radical sense of ate rather than the amartia of Creon. Like she's actually the more radical version of the death drive. He is still kind of, still hesitant and eventually changes his mind. So I was like, yeah, I mean, this is, in a sense, the interpretation that is there. What I haven't seen is like, well, what happens if you take the position not of the spectator that might be the, that metic tyrant, which gets you the singularity, but that might be the one that is like, are these citizens like, thinking about themselves as metic? Like I am the metic and I am subjected to all of this, particularly metic woman. Like it's like, I am subjected to this other set of regulations that are like, what if I then use Antigone for my own purposes rather than Antigone using my situation to frame, an aristocratic thing, which I'm like, I'm not saying in the engagement that this is not important, that this is not a crucial contribution. I try to be sensitive to doing that, but I'm also like, it doesn't speak to a lot of other problems for which, other kinds of exclusions and other kinds of issues are at stake. For example, the fact that she claims he was not his slave. Lacan makes a whole point about saying, how scandalous the third claim is. I am interested on why the second one is not scandalous. And the fact that, it receives very little commentary. I think the only book that seriously takes it on is Tina Chanter's, and I guess my mind is the second. And maybe, it's like, we don't accumulate readings in that sense. It's like, it's a very limited set of interventions. So even though there's part of me that feels we can spend long times discussing, tyranny and that spectator, and indeed the solitude, and I feel it's there. I feel it's not. It's there. It has been produced. It's part of the readership. Is not as interesting in my view as emphasizing that relationality, why this is the only way in which Polynesians can be included, and then what does it say about the continuities of certain modalities of slave relations, even when you move towards the metic, or even when the metic is thought as a position in which citizen and slave can come together actually, and through the reproduction, or not through the analysis of the reproduction of women. Adorno and dialectics, Tristan. Okay, this is, so on the one hand, I agree with you that there is, and I think this was very, Frederick Jameson does a very good job in his own interpretation of that text, as a text that is actually trying to move difference away from the enclosure of the dialectic. That the Hegelian dialectic is so totalizing that absolutely everything can be included within. And if one reads Derrida, is not any kind of inclusion, it's actually an inclusion within the familial. No, and a familial that is the monogamous bourgeois European family, that is the model of the familial. And that's one way of thinking about knowledge as well, to move that which is not familiar into the fold of the familiar. And I think that precisely in the effort of doing the disaffiliation, of giving you an Antigone that is quite unrecognizably classic and so on, I am gesturing towards a difference that I would say I find more of a resonance with the way in which Deleuze reads Nietzsche as a thinker of difference than Hegel's, or than Hegel's retrospective view of history, even though my book follows a triad that, that kind of in a sense reproduces a little bit of that image of the spirit from antiquity to modernity to postmodernity. And the new is not, there is a level of invention in the new, but I'm also thinking about the new as precisely what has not been able to be spoken. I think I'm Spivakian in that sense, and Spivak is the other kind of methodological, guide, since I published that piece on Oedipus, and in a way in which new is not just invention, new is also unbarring, and in a sense unlearning, things and habits of thought and many things that are there if you give interpretations that work with and against the canon. And so it's not new in the sense that I invented it. It's new in the sense that or in the sense of restoring the pieces in the mirror. It is new in the sense that if you see the cracks, and something slips into the framework, and you can do creative things with that. And not quite the project of Adorno, but it is, in my view, a way of mobilizing differences. So the past that is not really the past is, it has the sense that indeed you're mentioning that there are losses that we haven't confronted, and I guess this speaks to Ellie's question on the Anthropocene. I think that part of the depoliticizing discourse of the Anthropocene is precisely a consequence of not confronting the losses of the conquest and the transatlantic slave trade. Racial capitalocene is precisely addressing the break, addressing the break in the ice, the many breaks that I retraced in the book, in which there is an echo of something, of another voice, and a voice that you need to understand in the double sense of it's also saying that it cannot speak, which is the Spivakian, the Spivakian is not just that the subaltern doesn't have a voice, or it's not saying anything. It is that the frameworks under which whatever you say are received are already anticipate the message, henceforth, you cannot speak. And I have mobilized that in a variety of ways to also reinterpret Judith Butler's work on settler colonialism and so on. And so I would say that if on the one hand, the past persists, there's also an interrogation that I do raise to Honig and to classicization, and is like, whose past are we thinking, or to whose past are we establishing an affiliation here? Am I trying to voice, what I think citizens would have seen? Am I trying to voice what those who were not allowed to see, might have heard it when the masters came back to talk about the play that they saw in the tragedy in the household, and then the slaves are overhearing that conversation, and so forth and so on, this is pure imaginary, this pure misreading of the play to some degree, because of course I don't have that. No, I have to build, in a sense, the archive. And I would end with necrodialectics, which I think is the very optimistic way of finishing my remarks. The necrodialectics come precisely from a way of, a more Benjaminian way of not thinking this about progress, but maybe staying with catastrophe. And is that in the way that I frame the conversation, the move from the ancient to the modern to the postmodern, is that there is a problematization of the corpse. So for me, the paradigmatic modern Antigone remains Anouilh's, kind of sentimentalized version of Antigone, but not just because of the way in which, it melodramatizes Antigone, which is the route that, for example, Bonihoni takes and some others, but because of what happens to Polynices. So I think that what is going on with the corpse is actually more politically more insightful. In antiquity, in a sense, the corpse, and I would risk the speculative claim that indeed the beginning of politics is not with the killing of the enemy, but with the mistreatment of the corpse. Now, that politics, in a sense, or the problem of the policy starts not just when you committed the crime of actually killing, but when there is not a redress of that, there is not a way of mourning or a way of addressing that violence, it gives continuity and it continues post-mortem. In the case of Socrates, in the case of Sophocles, you have the sovereign gesture of instrumentalizing Polynices in order to rework the friend-enemy distinction. He's gonna use the Polynices, whoever buries Polynices is now a way of recirculating the kind of military anti-enemy gesture as a way of policing the social, or that is as modern as I can get in the discourse of biopolitics. But in the case of Anouilh, which is a more sympathetic creon, which I also think is more interesting. Now we're moving not towards the tyrant, but we're moving into democratic governability and liberal, presumptions of inclusion into norms of subjects and recognition of their agency. So it's way more interesting. Is that Creon doesn't know who he buried as Polynices, and actually he doesn't care. And it's like, I just took the one that was worse and that was not, the one that was not as terrible as a corpse, and that's the one that I gave the funeral rites. But it could be a Theocles that is being mistreated as Polynices, and it kind of interrupts Antigone. And to the problem of that instrumentalization, now Antigone needs to respond with an additional question, which is about the identity of this, is it Polynices or is it not? But the location of the burial is still, she can't go and dig it, like it's still there. What I think happens in postmodernity and in the recrudescence of the sovereign instrumentalization of bodies, particularly with the phenomenon of enforced disappearances, is that not only the identity is suspended, like you don't know actually, the state is claiming that they are still alive or that they don't know, and you also don't have a site. And it's not just one Polynices, which is both in these cases, all the Antigones that are, the postmodern the widows, they are confronting a plurality of Polynices in mass. And this dialectic text, so then I move to the next, okay, let's, something is happening with the corpse. A greater instrumentalization of the corpse is saying to us something much deeper about democracy, that in this case appears considerably more tyrannical than even officially anti-democratic systems, and because neither Colombia or Mexico, are represent themselves as an as a dictatorship, as Chile was, during that time. Even though the phenomenon of enforced disappearances is actually significantly more monumental than what happened in Chile during the dictatorship, and that for me also says something very, very important about all these indistinctions, all the things that necropolitics is searching in terms of how these different technologies of power becomes indistinctive. And for me, the arrival of that, which I'm calling the necrodialectic, is the phenomenon of falsus positivos, which is a thing that at least the first time that I, as a political scientist, learned of it was in the Colombian case. But of course, Mexico today has, it's even, the situation is even worse in Mexico than it is in Colombia, and it's still an ongoing problem in Colombia. What happens is that in order to how do you say, get the payment, the extra payment on efficiency in combat against the insurgency, what the military does is that they kill peasants and then they claim that those peasants were members of the guerrilla. So this undesirability of both the identity and the location is instrumentalized for monetary remuneration in order to get revenue from the state. And even worse than that, one of the things that this happens, this has been discovered since I wrote the book, is that they are now burying in the tombstones of all of those that are identified. They are now using those tombstones to then bury the ones that are disappeared. And so, because now we have a process in which there is a whole unit of victims in Colombia that does the search. The situation in Mexico is worse. It's the woman that has taken on the roles of the state because the state refuses to recognize feminicide and the disappearance of the woman. But in Colombia, there is a unit of victims that is doing this search. They have identified that even those that have the name under the tombstones are not actually the ones that are buried there. And which this keeps the layers of disidentification and of the effort of the state to these guys, its operations of terror, are significantly more sophisticated and are significantly more difficult in terms of Antigone cannot just do this public speech. Like there are many other things that then need to happen, and that's the one that I want to speak to, like in a sense. That's the one that when I'm reading the play and I'm thinking about confronting a mourning that is declared as the enemy of the state, and that if you do that mourning, then you risk death from the sovereign, which is what happens in Mexico and in Colombia and happened in Chile during the dictatorship. And I want to recontextualize that under this domain of how neoliberalism intensifies processes that one can trace back all the way to the colony and to the disregard for indigenous peoples, which is an ongoing thing. It's not obviously a thing of the past. I'm going to leave it there, but thanks a lot for those comments, and I welcome the audience, and thank you. Thanks for the patience and for listening.
Thanks a lot, Andres, and forgive us for overburdening you with questions. Let me open it up. So if people have questions, you can type the letter Q in the chat function and I'll call on you. Or if you prefer, you're welcome to write the question in the chat and I'll read it. Are there any questions from the audience at the moment? Ben's got a question, and unless someone else pops up, I think
it's not a question. It's not a question. It's just I just wanted to say how much I really enjoyed what you've just been saying in the last 20 minutes or so. I just find that your reading of the Antigone and the way that you're sort of pivoting it towards the kind of critique that you're undertaking sounds really great, and I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of your book, actually.
Any other questions? All comments, praise is welcome as well.
You know, at one point I thought about suggesting the editor to call it Anti-Antigone, settler colonial capitalism and the colonial critique, like to kind of play with Deleuze's and Guattari's anti-Oedipus. But on the one hand, I was like, people are going to be so disappointed when they encounter this text, and it's not like the kind of Deleuzian engagement. But also I was like, it's not really anti-anti. I mean, you cannot quite be just anti-anti. Like it's alter, or I don't know. It's a different. Let's say the anti doesn't play the role that in the move towards schizoanalysis, you know, the anti plays for Deleuze and Guattari's engagement with you know, the Oedipal complex. That's just why did I came with that? Because it's many. I came to that because of something that you say, Ben, and this has to do with the course of Oedipus and my engagement with the question of the family, and perhaps I think I call it the Antigone's own anti-Oedipal gesture of privileging the natal over the conjugal family, to the extent that as an epicleros in Greek antiquity would have been Oedipus's house that would have been continued. And I used that in order to then make a break with the fact that natal alienation and the constitutive role that natal alienation plays for the social death of the slave in modernity makes it impossible for Seth, in the case of Toni Morrison's Beloved, or for the you know, the different slaves that Saidiya Harman traces in that book, to engage in the same kind of instrumentalization of the passing of property, or the fact that you have that, you know, transitory connection to the property, which even Metic women had. As far as I know, like, this is again my very brief research on classical Greek, but as slaves could not. And so these are all of those moments in which I feel that the intervention is like, great, awesome, like queer theory can do things with social death, but if you really confront the problem of the you know, what is assumed as sociality when you're thinking about other ways of doing kinship, or in the Liederman's anti-reproductive futurism, giving up together and, you know, giving on the future, all together in the future, giving up on it. And you really need to dig in what's the meaning of, like, what was the condition, what is the condition of slavery, and how different is the agency or the lack of agency in these circumstances. So it's many. Let's hear, and I'll be thinking about it's many.
Let's throw to the two questions that have come up. I might take them together just so that they both get heard. So we'll start with Emma Bianchi, and then I'll throw to Brooke.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for this, Andrés. I really look forward to reading the book properly, because, you know, I mean, I'm one of these people. I mean, I'm teaching a course on tragedy at the moment. We just read all the Theban plays last week in class, so we're just about to read Hegel. But I also, you know, I'm sort of, you know, been delving into, you know, all of these queer theoretical and sort of Black studies discourses as well. So I'm just really thrilled that you're sort of bringing these frameworks together, and I'm really looking forward to kind of actually seeing what you know, what you say. But I suppose, you know, I've also written. I'm also really pleased that you've picked up on this notion of Antigone as metoikos, because I've written on that myself. I've not published on it, but I've given talks and stuff on this idea. And the way that I've always approached it is not to bring, you know, all of these kinds of different epochs together, but to sort of think about the way that the metoikos, a woman, is more free in a sense than a citizen woman in classical antiquity, and the sense in which she is, you know, Antigone is a crosser of boundaries. I mean, of course we know, and of course, you know, in Butler's reading we've got this sense of a living on that she represents, you know, a sort of shadowy living on. But I mean, this is, you know, this sort of ambiguous status that she has as a, and then this makes me think about, you know, the Antigone as a play and its mobility. And so the Antigone as a play and Antigone as a figure as figures for a kind of mobility, and therefore potentially for a kind of activism. So I just wonder if that's something that you pick up on in the book, or, you know, is Antigone a figure for a kind of mobility and a kind of activism for you?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I wish I could have been on those lectures, or like, because I was looking for those references. But indeed, in chapter 1, I make the same point, the point that you're making, Emanuela, and is that the metic condition of Antigone actually might help us to explain why the differential agency. So I try to, you know, take that in order to make my case as well for how what a metic also interpretation of Antigone allows us to read or to solve in terms of her differential experience. And it's not just Antigone, you know, Oedipus becomes a metic in Colonus rather than a citizen. I follow, is it Vidal-Nequet or Pierre Vernant? One of the two that makes that argument in the Myth and Tragedy. So yes, and there is a whole section on activism, particularly on maternal activism in chapter 3. So it's not just about, you know, the violence of the state, is also the counter, you know, political resistance of dissident mourning, the funeralization of the city, how Elba Orozco Mendoza calls it. Like there are many gestures of that level of mobility in the book, indeed.
Let me quickly ask Brooke Holmes to ask her question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andres. This is wonderful. And I'm sorry I came in a little bit late. So, and I'm going to listen to the beginning with the recording, but it's just so rich. And I'll do this quickly because I know we don't have much time, but I'm going to trick you and do a 2-part question, which is, I'm curious about the extent to which Antigone functions as metonymic of either tragedy or the classical. And if so, is it through a kind of entanglement within a kind of founding modernity in Hegel or in, you know, a political theoretical reading tradition? Or what would you do, let me put it like this, if you were to read Medea, which is a text that I'm teaching now, and have, you know, and Dimitri Kazimis has just written this piece on, you know, the refugees. So I'm wondering how that she would work differently within the larger context of what you're doing precisely as a site of reception. And then my tacked on question that I'm curious about, especially around this question of mobility, is the diasporic nature of text, and whether diaspora or the movement of text, how that changes what the past is as a site of counter-hegemonic reading. And so on the one hand, because the text is so embedded in the genealogy of the settler colonial West and a set of power structures, then it's a reading from a site of resistance. And I don't think this is incompatible with that, but I'm curious what you think about the very diasporic nature of these texts, or the disruption of, say, the Mediterranean as, you know, Greece as a site, you know, that's just Athens, but maybe much more global and has a much more global reception that doesn't just go through Western Europe. And there you start to go through some, you know, like Susan Buck-Morse's claim about a kind of communist notion of the past. And I think those are compatible notions, but I wonder, I guess the way I would ask it to you is the communist nature of the past masking the power relations that continue to structure reception, or is there liberatory potential in denying the ownership at its root, you know, at modernity's root? Or what would it look like to both acknowledge the work that it's done and to take it away from the genealogical work that's been claimed for it? And that goes back to that kind of anti-canonical, since you're necessarily repeating the canon, right?
These are great, Brooke. Thanks a lot for that. So on the one hand, I would say that in the text, and this is something that I probably need to reconsider. Indeed, Antigone, I haven't, or I didn't do a good work, let's say, on thinking the privilege that Antigone has as a classical text that then stands not just for tragedy, but for the classics. And I must confess that indeed, and I had this conversation with Dimi, that when I moved to Antigone is because of the obviousness of Medea's metoikia. And the non-obviousness of Antigone's metoikia. Like when I first say Antigone is a metic, people were like, okay, this is absurd. Like this absolutely makes no sense. Saying that of Medea is not a controversial claim. Like she's very clearly a metic, and it might not have been, politicized sufficiently in the ways in which I think Dim is right in claiming it. And indeed, for Sarah Brill's co-edited volume next year, I am writing on La Llorona, Seth, and Medea. And so the work is going there, and is working on why the Medea in Black Dionysus. I don't know if you're familiar with that work from Wetmore, which is about the reception of the classic tradition, but in performance in the theater. And he distinguishes three paradigms of reception: Black Athena, which is the kind of reclamation of the Afro-Asiatic roots of Greek antiquity in the style of Bernal, and Black Orpheus, which is more the Sartre's version of his own critique of negritude, that is perhaps the most problematic, and then the one that he's mobilizing as Black Dionysus. And I'm using that for another piece, where the question of time and the past and the communist is going to be more present in that piece about the how to confront the ahistoricity that has been imputed into Africa and into Blackness, in this impossibility to ever coalesce into making history. And I think that the undercommons, which I also mobilize here from Fred Moten and Stefano Horny, to engage in a dialogue. Settler colonial indigeneity has also done the same, by the way. Like, this is not exclusive of Black production, but there is a commons from the Marxist tradition that is still compatible with the continuous taking of the land of indigenous peoples and the refusal to confront, let's say, the differential alienation of Black people that were not just exploited but transmogrified into a commodity. And I think that both Moten and other things that I take from indigeneity gets us into complicating, the ways of turning back into history with this, comprehensive inclusionary embrace that hasn't quite, wrestled with the differential power. And I like a lot the way that you put it. In I'm not going to be able to reproduce that, but I feel that the way that you put it, that it might reinforce that if we don't struggle with the reinforcement of the canon of that, we might not actually, we might get a communism that is still, oblivious of the undercommons or oblivious of, decolonizing the land. So yes, there is work that is driving in that direction of rethinking what I wanted to say. Sorry, one short thing is that in Wetmore's work, the paradigm actually of Black Orpheus in the U.S. is the Medea, or the interpretation of Seth, Margaret Garner, and Seth then in Beloved as a contemporary Medea, and there are like many plays. Like this is not just one iteration. He thinks it's extremely problematic, perhaps with the exception of Susan Laurie Parks' Venus, not Venus, but Susan Laurie Parks has a version of it, which I also like a lot, and I'm working with that in the exercise of putting it in conversation. But I'm doing something similar in terms of bringing, once again, modernity, indigeneity, and Blackness to bear on how different the motivation for the infanticide is in the case of Medea, when you contrast that gesture with, let's say, La Llorona in the anti-Spanish, tradition in what would then become Mexico, and then with Seth against white supremacy. And part of the exercise of that text is precisely this, like, you take the canonical text gives you an audience and a readership, but you use it in order to voice a different cry. You don't use it to recanonize it, even though that is inevitable. Like you're still reproducing it, and that comes with it. That's not a possibility. But my hope is that indeed, when you read a beautiful book like Antigone, Carson's wonderful new contemporaneous interpretation, Antigone suggests a set of readings that are still the white global north theoretical production. And I end a little bit with that claim of like, why not looking for Antigona Gonzalez, and not to say that you shouldn't read Antigone, but like to say like you read it together with read it together with Gonzalez, read Hegel, but read Hegel together with the Bernasconi's claim on how incredibly problematic he's absolutely not only lumping together Ashanti and Dahomey practices in Africa, but exaggerating many other yes, read. I think it's impossible not to read that, but read it together with the other text.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have more questions, and I'll keep them for a later conversation because that just was wonderful. Thank you.
We've gone over time, and I don't want to burden Andres further or our audience's patience. So that's probably a good place to wrap up. Thanks so much, Andres. This has been very stimulating. Thanks a lot to Ely for your engagement, to Ben,
thank you to you
for all the questioners.
Great stuff. Thank you, Andres. And thanks, Tristan.
All the best. Thanks, everyone. See you next month.